right. Welcome, everyone, to our Eclectics Diversity series. And today I have the great pleasure of introducing three wonderfully successful women who will share with us their past and their current endeavors. I'm going to introduce all three speakers at once, and then they'll speak in turn, and we'll wait for questions until the end of the total presentation. Okay? Okay, here we go. So I'm going to start to present Emily Lee, who is a professor and chair of philosophy at Cal State Fullerton, and her research interests include feminist philosophy, philosophy of race, and phenomenology. I hope that's close.
Phenomenology.
Phenomenology, thank you. Especially the works of Maurice Merleau-Ponty,
Mhm.
and she has published many articles on we'll do this again. If you speak for me, Emily, that would be helpful.
Uh,
Phen- phen-
Phenomenology.
and epistemology in regards to the embodiment and subjectivity of women and color. She is the editor of Living Alterities. And could you help me with this one as well?
um, Phenomenology,
Embodiment,
embodiment, and race.
right. Uh, she's currently working on revisions to her book, which is Phenomenology of Race. And she will be our first speaker. Our second speaker today is Susie Woo, who is an associate professor of American Studies at Cal State Fullerton, where she teaches courses on race and immigration. She received a master's degree in Asian American Studies from UCLA and a PhD in American Studies from Yale University. Her book, Framed by War, Korean Children and Women at the Crossroads of U.S. Empire, centers on Korean War orphans, adoptees, and military brides, was presented to OLLI a few months ago, and many of us were fortunate enough to hear her presentation about this wonderful book. She's published essays in scholarly journals about the Korean orphan choir that toured the U.S. after the Korean War and the racial integration of the national blood supply in 1950. A native Southern Californian, she loves teaching, baking, and going to the beach with her family, which includes three young boys. Our third speaker today is Chea, who serves as the coordinator of Asian Pacific American Resource Center. Prior to Cal State Fullerton, she worked as a program coordinator at the Asian Pacific Student Programs at the University of California, Riverside. Hathia, her formal name, holds a Master of Arts in College Student Development and Administration from Shepherd University in West Virginia, and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of California, Berkeley. She's a member of ACPA, NASPA, CACCCHE, and Asian Pacific Americans in Higher Education. So please welcome our three amazing speakers, and we will now start.
I just have a few photos to share, and really, I'm just going to be talking about, I guess, kind of my life growing up Korean in America. So, my parents were born in Korea, and my mom was born in 1943, and my dad was born in 1936, which means that they both survived the Korean War. So, for those of you who are at my last talk, when I talked about my book, I explained some of this story, but for those of you who weren't there, my mom was 7 when the Korean War began, and her father was killed in the war. He was actually a police chief in their town, so he was targeted by North Korean soldiers. So he was killed during the war. She was hiding in the house when North Korean soldiers came to take him away. And my mother also lost her older sister in the war. And so she had this really, she has all this trauma, you know, from the war. And she was also the oldest in her family, which meant that after the loss of her father, she had to start working at a very young age. She actually worked in a doll factory to make money for her family. Now, my dad's experience was really different. He was about 14 when the war began, and he was a teenager, and he spent a lot of time on US military bases. And so he would often go through the trash at the end of the day and he would find copies of Life magazine and Look magazine. And this is kind of where his love for America began. So he loved American cars, he loved Elvis, he listened to the armed forces radio so he could listen to American music. So he grew up with rock and roll. My mom and dad met after the war and they had my sister. So here's my dad and my mom and my sister and my dad's mom. And this was taken in Korea right before they immigrated to the United States. So they came to the US in 1969. And some of you are probably familiar with the immigration law of 1965, which one of the provisions or one of the abilities to come to the United States was through sponsorship. And so my parents were low-skilled laborers and they were sponsored by another Korean family who they were friends with who lived in Arizona. And so my dad came and he did mother of pearl inlay. So there are placards and he did this inlay. He's an artist. And so he did this inlay. That's how he got to come to America. My mom got to come because of her doll making skills. And so they both did this, but found quickly that they didn't have enough money. And so they both worked as janitors in a Cadillac dealership. And my mom always talks about how when they came here, they had, you know, about $300 and then they had to, you know, make their way. And so they did this for a while. My dad took his first paycheck and went to an Elvis concert. He said that Elvis was teeny tiny. He couldn't afford a very fancy ticket. So but he did. That was like the first thing he did, which really shows me, you know, his love of American culture. And then they decided to move to California. And so they moved to California, and that's when they moved to California here. So can you see this slide? This is them in their first apartment in Los Angeles. And here's my little sister, my older sister when she was little. Here she is in her Korean hanbok with their little Christmas tree. My mom worked as a waitress in Los Angeles, and my dad stayed at home to raise my sister. And then I came along. Oh, here's my grandma. She came actually from Korea to raise my sister. And I think that this is something that happens, you know, pretty commonly with Korean families, is that the grandparent is often brought over to raise the kids because both of the parents are working. And that is exactly what happened with our family. I came along in 1973. This is my sister. She pretty much raised me, you know, she's 6 years older than I am. So she, you know, my parents worked all the time. We were latchkey kids. We came home and she would make me my after school snack and we'd watch TV and kind of barely do homework, but mostly watch TV and hang out. And that's kind of how we were, how I was raised. I was really raised by her. And so we grew up in Los Angeles. I was born in Glendale. We grew up in Los Angeles. And when I was in the 6th grade, my parents took us to Korea. And I just remember feeling like my Korean's okay. It's not great, but it was so very clear to me once I was there that I was not really Korean. And I was, you know, 12 at the time. And I think that realization was, I didn't quite know what to do with that. You know, I could speak some Korean, but culturally, I could tell that there was so much I didn't understand about Korea. And I definitely wanted to learn more. And I think that this is when I started to really focus on my Korean identity. Whereas I think when I was in school, I was one of the only Asian kids in my school. And I just wanted to be white like everybody else. And so I think that it was really in the 6th grade where I started to become kind of interested in my Korean culture. And that's something that I kind of carried with me, I think, through high school and especially when I got to college. And so my parents owned dry cleaners. My parents actually owned
first my mom owned a cafe. They saved up enough money. And like many Koreans, they opened a small business. And so my mom's cafe, her real name is Moon, but she decided to name it Angie's Cafe. And I think she wanted it to sound very American. And I totally never understood that. I was like, your name's so pretty. Like, I don't know why you're changing it. But she first had a cafe in downtown Los Angeles, and then they owned 3 dry cleaners. So growing up, my sister and I worked in the dry cleaners. Like every summer we were there, dry cleaners are open all the time, except for Sundays. They had shorter hours on Sundays, but they're open all the time. And so my sister and I worked in the dry cleaners all the time. And when I went to college, I went to UC Irvine for my undergrad. All the summers and on the weekends, I would work in my parents' dry cleaners. And this is something that, happens a lot in the Korean community, where you have entrepreneurs who own a small business, and then their family become, free laborers for them, right? And it's not that, by no means was I free. They were paying for my college. I paid for my, to live in the dorms. I had a job on campus, but, they paid for my college education. And this is just what we did. There were kind of no questions or no conversations about it. And, it was definitely challenging at times. There were certainly other things I wanted to be doing on the weekends, but it was something that was really important and just kind of an unspoken thing that we did as a family. At UC Irvine, I studied art history. And then when I graduated, I had no idea what to do with it. And so I actually wrote a letter to the LA County Museum of Art and to the education department, because I kind of thought that maybe I would want to teach. And I said, I'll work for free if you need an intern. I just got my degree in art history. And so they said, sure, come on over. So I started working at the LA County Museum of Art. And it started out as an internship, and it turned into a full-time job. And I had worked there from 1995 to 1999. And while I was there one summer, I got to work on this program where we got to work with high school students from LA Unified School District and also from Compton Unified School District. And I was really close in age with these high school students. And what we were doing is we were teaching them how to become peer docents, like guides at the museum. And it was during this time that I actually became close friends with them, and they had very different lives than I did. I grew up in the suburbs in Arcadia, and these were students who went to high schools where the graduation rates were around 30% or lower. And it floored me. I couldn't understand how we could all be living in Los Angeles and have such very different lives. And I became incredibly interested in race relations. Now, I should step back for just a moment and say that in 1992, I think I was a freshman or almost a sophomore in college. And this, of course, is when the Los Angeles uprisings happened. And my mom, who owned a dry cleaners at the time in Hacienda Heights, I called her and said, you've got to go home. Like, I don't know what's going on, but it looks like they're targeting Korean stores, and like, you're not safe there. And my mom was really upset. And she said, you were born in America and you are Korean. So you need to go to the news and talk to them and tell them that we're good people and tell them that we're just working hard and to please stop the violence. And I remember being very frozen at the time, because I understood very little about race relations. I also was young, and so I just didn't know what to say. And I was like, that's such a huge responsibility. Like, I can't possibly speak for all Koreans. I don't even know what's going on. And I just remember feeling really sad about the fact and hopeless about the fact that I didn't understand what was happening. I was clearly uneducated in these matters. I had all these feelings, but I didn't know what to do with them. And so that is something that I carried with me through my college years. And it was really during this summer program at LACMA that I decided that it was time for me to do something about it all these years later, right? So I was like, I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to learn about race relations. So I applied for the Asian American Studies program at UCLA. And so I left the museum and I went there. And while I was there, I studied race relations. I learned so much more about the LA uprisings, and I put together a conference to talk about the LA uprisings, and it was really a pivotal moment for me. And it was during my time in that program that I also realized how much I enjoyed research. And so I decided to continue my studies, and I applied to various history programs and American studies programs, and I went to Yale for American studies. And when I got there, I mean, never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that I could go to Yale. And I had grown up in California. I only applied to California schools in that one outlying program. So when I went there, it was quite a culture shock. I have to say that all of a sudden I was the only Asian student. There was one other student in my program, and I felt like I was in elementary school again, where that was the demographic when I was in elementary school. So it was, I definitely felt out of place. I had gone to public schools my entire life. And so it was definitely a challenge, for me to be there. I almost dropped out, I think, a number of times and decided to kind of stick through it. And so it was interesting in the sense that I was in an American studies program, and my work revolved around Korean Americans and Koreans, which I often at times felt like I had to defend the work that I was doing and to make it legitimate. I think that some people believed that what I studied was maybe not as important as what they studied. And that's something that I really struggled with. And that was definitely a challenge. But I made it through the program, and there were wonderful people there too. It wasn't everybody. There were wonderful people there as well, very supportive. And after I graduated, I had my first son. Here are all my kids. This happened. This was taken a little while ago. This Calix is now 12, Selah's 8, and Milo is 6 now. But when I was finishing my dissertation, he came along. And then I had this moment of thinking about, well, I've done all of this work, this schoolwork, and I feel like I should really apply myself, but at the same time, I'm a new mother and I don't quite know how to balance these things. So I started to just teach some classes. I taught at UCLA and at Loyola Marymount, and then I got a postdoc at USC, and that's when this happened. And that's when number 2 came along. And then I decided, I'm going to push through. I'm going to finish my book. I would love to get a job. And it's in 2013 that I got to come to Cal State Fullerton. And this was, and still is, absolutely my dream job. I love the students at Cal State Fullerton. I am so thrilled that I get to stay in California. In academia, you don't always have those kinds of options. So I feel incredibly fortunate. And then my first year at Cal State Fullerton is when Milo came, and that was a surprise. And so, and that's kind of where I'm at now. And I'm, I teach courses on race and immigration. I did finish my book in 2019. It finally came out. It took me, I think, 14 years from start to finish. Just because there are a lot of fits and starts, I think, with that book. But my book is about the Korean War. I think that I've kind of come full circle, as I've grown older. I've come full circle to connect with this part of my parents' past that has been so painful that they never really talked to me about it growing up. And that's why I wanted to write, a history about Korean women and children and their experiences during this war. And so that book came out, which is really exciting. And now I'm really focusing all of my energies on teaching and raising these kids. And so I teach courses. This semester, I'm teaching a course on race and American studies. I'm also teaching a general education course, an intro course on American studies. But I finally, at 47, I finally feel like I have struck some kind of a balance between the connections that I would like to have with my parents' past, and with my Korean roots, which again, I was born in Glendale. So, one step removed from Korea, but, I'm teaching my kids Korean. Every Wednesday is Korean school. It doesn't go well. I'll just put it that way. They're pretty much done with school by the time I get to them on Wednesdays. But, I definitely feel like it's really important for them to understand their Korean roots. They're actually half Korean, quarter Mexican, quarter German. And so I feel very, committed to assure that they understand their Korean roots, because I think that it's an incredibly important and really powerful part of who they are. And so I think I should probably stop there. But yeah, I think I'll just go ahead and stop there.
Well, Susie, thank you so much. And the photos of your boys are just adorable, but you can see where they would be energetic and keeping you on your toes, in addition to all the, yeah. All right. So, Emily, how are we doing with the documents?
I'm ready, actually. I dropped them into the chat. So I couldn't find my version. I actually just Googled the New York Times article and put the URL into the chat. And I dropped the other article that's in it's published in the American Philosophical Association newsletter into the chat as well. So it should be all there. So I did not prepare pictures. I have lots of pictures on my computer, but but I thought I would just read it. I'm not. I don't know if it's for all the reasons that Susie was saying about the delegitimization of certain areas as scholarship or not. But I'm not very comfortable talking about me or my past or any of that. I've realized I've started doing them partly just because I've been directly asked about them. So I have these short pieces where I end up having to actually talk about myself, and I'm still really not comfortable doing it. So I'm going to act like a traditional philosopher, and I know it's weird saying it that way, but I'm going to act like a traditional philosopher. I'm just going to read. I hope that's okay. It's not an argument, so I think people could follow along. I don't think it's if it's an argument, I would have given you a handout. But I did want to begin by thanking you, Janice, for this invitation and for this event. I do think increasing awareness of diversity and about Asian American women is, of course, very important, as it is one of my areas of specialization in regards to the embodiment of women of color. Okay, so if you don't mind, I'm going to read, and as I said, I dropped it into the chat. So if you'd like to follow along, you can just open up the document and read along with. So I titled this piece "A Small Act of Rebellion Toward Philosophy as a Gift." I was asked the questions of how did I end up becoming a philosopher, and one of the reasons I was asked this question is because in philosophy in the United States, there's only about, I want to say 3% Asian and Asian American people who are philosophers. So, and then among that, I think women are like 0.5%, if anything. Hence, I was asked the question of how did I end up becoming a philosopher and an Asian American woman philosopher. So, hence, here I am trying to answer that question. I was asked the question again of how did I become an Asian American woman philosopher? And then I was subsequently asked the question, how did I choose the specialization I did choose? How did I end up to specialize in what I do? So here it goes. Thinking about the value of autobiographical narratives, I ponder the role of my Asian descent. Most of my work insists that identity, especially racial identity, influences the development of subjectivity. But I'm not sure that my Asian descent is more influential than my gender, class, or sexual orientation. Nevertheless, race functions as one of the defining features of my identity, not because of essentialistic, traditional, and cultural practices that are so deeply ingrained in me that they have become natural, but because the visible differences of my embodiment condition my experiences. I am an immigrant. Immigration destinations are never random. The strategic stationing of US troops in South Korea during the Cold War conditioned our immigration pattern. I lived my first 5 years in Korea and the next 5 years on the island of Guam. To date, I have lived the majority of my life, 17 years, in New York City, predominantly in the Bronx, but also the Upper West Side and Brooklyn. Needless to say, the three regions are vastly different in culture and language, as well as in natural environment, although Seoul and New York City are similar in climate. The idea to pursue a doctorate in philosophy came from my undergraduate advisor in economics. I was an economics major. My undergraduate thesis impressed Professor Andre Bergstahler, not for its economic analysis, but for its philosophical analysis. Neoclassical economics, which is the capitalist economic theory that is taught at the majority of the universities in the United States, disparages the use of welfare policies. I wrote a thesis defending welfare policies. Neoclassical economics relies on utilitarianism, an idea that I knew to be highly contested among philosophers. I took only one philosophy class as an undergraduate. My knowledge of philosophy at that time came from participating as a Lincoln Douglas debater in high school. In Ocean Vuong's novel, On Earth, We Are Briefly Gorgeous, I don't know if you have heard of him, but he just won the MacArthur for that novel. He's a Vietnamese immigrant, actually. He plays with the idea that memory is a choice. Autobiographical narratives represent choices about what to highlight. Because these are musings about my Asian descent, let me begin again and forward that I ended up earning my PhD in philosophy in reaction against a junior high school teacher who stereotyped me and placed me on a math team rather than a debate team without consulting me. I can only surmise that it had something to do with being Asian. By the way, I heard Amy Tan, the whole reason she started to write was because some junior high school teacher placed her on a math team. In rebellion against such stereotyping, I joined the debate team in high school. I wanted to try debate precisely because someone thought that it would not be one of my strengths. It turned out I was actually good at debate. I attended the Bronx High School of Science, and I was a debate captain and the New York State debate champion during my senior year, to give some context. As a high school debater, I read Plato's Republic, Locke's Second Treatise on Civil Government, Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and Rawls's A Theory of Justice. These are four very prominent philosophy books. I'm sure my understanding was far from thorough, but I very much enjoyed the ideas. I don't recommend debate to students. It absorbed too much of my energy and attention. It did not benefit my school grades. But because of this background, I knew about the arguments against utilitarianism. And hence I applied some of those arguments against neoclassical economic analysis that devalued welfare policies. Professor Bergstahler was impressed enough to suggest that I consider a PhD in philosophy. He urged me to ensure that I make my life meaningful. At first, I did not listen to him. I am an immigrant. My parents do not really speak English. I felt the need to earn money to help with my family's financial status. To give credit to my parents, they're fine. They do not rely on me financially. But as with all capitalistic urges, one can always do better. So I stuck with economics, planned to earn an MBA, and got a job in business. I worked for an internet access company for a year, for a microeconomic consulting firm for another year, and then finally for a financial newspaper reporting on the bank loan market. Clearly, I had a variety of experiences. I jumped around because I did not find the work meaningful to me personally. I did not want to expend so much energy focusing on matters I really did not care that much about. All of these jobs were initially interesting because of a learning curve. But eventually, after about 6 months, I was bored. I was so bored that I found myself hiding in my cubicle reading philosophy. I read all the works of Michel Foucault and Nietzsche, and Friedrich Nietzsche. Because I did not quite understand everything, I wanted to engage with people about these texts. While hiding in these cubicles and reading Foucault's description of the architectural designs for early schools and prisons, that their walls were designed to be just high enough that one never quite knows when someone is watching, I realized that my cubicles were designed for the exact same reasons. I decided I'd like to know more. So I made a very selfish decision and decided to give philosophy a chance. The PhD was a gift to myself. I have not been bored since. I do not regret my decision. I know it was the right decision for me. So that answered the question of how did I end up becoming a philosopher? To answer the question of why of my specialization in philosophy, here it is. The most influential experience from my childhood that affects my philosophical specialization is that I grew up working as a cashier at my parents' fruit and vegetable store. My parents' means of earning a living fits squarely with the Asian American history. I think, Susie, I'm going to disagree with you. I don't think it's just Korean. It is the Asian American history of self-employment through opening small retail stores such as laundromats, restaurants, and grocery stores because of the difficulties of employment and other venues in the aftermath of a series of anti-Asian immigration laws. I worked every available Sunday. I decided to work on Sundays. It was a gesture of love from my parents. Again, to be sure to give credit to my parents, they paid me. But more important to me than the money was volunteering to give them a break for the week. The stores were located mostly in poor neighborhoods in the Bronx. Alone with just another worker who spoke mostly Spanish, I was left in charge of the cash register. Most of the time, the store was empty. Sundays are not busy days. There was a little rush after Sunday services, but the afternoons were usually slow. Most of the time, I was bored. And I wonder now if when I first read Marx in college, I gravitated toward it precisely because I experienced the alienation of mind-numbing work. The experience is unforgettable. The customers were mostly African American or Latin American. And did I mention that they were poor? The dynamics are something I'm still trying to understand. Let me begin by noting that my mother raised us as Catholics. I am not anymore. But she believed in considering and sharing with the less fortunate. In other words, questions about what it means to be good was already always circling my attention. With this religiously inspired backdrop, while cashiering at these low-end stores where the customers always inquired about my relationship to the owners, I felt the resentment from the customers that we, as new immigrants, still had more. This period of Sunday cashiering lasted longer than a decade and overlapped with the demonstrations and riots against Korean store owners in Black neighborhoods, including the LA riots. I occupied the position of having to survey the customers to check for shoplifters, even if most of the time I really did not care when someone took something or not. I wondered if we should just let them have it, since they needed it that much. Usually, if we caught a shoplifter, they just dropped the item and left the store. So why the need to constantly monitor? I guess the worry was a slippery slope argument about too much shoplifting impacting the store's purpose of financially providing for my family. I wondered if I had internalized the racist narratives about Black people as more likely to shoplift. Consequently, did I monitor them more? Whatever the reason, the constant monitoring was part of the job, so conflicts arose. During such conflicts, the customers hurled racist epithets at me. Most commonly, the African Americans suggested that I go home, where I came from. I had wondered about this particular response. Do African Americans feel a greater sense of ownership of the United States? In that situation, they allied with whites in guarding the borders of the United States by determining those who belonged and those who did not. I always found that sense of proprietary ownership of the United States interesting in light of the history of slavery. Perhaps especially because of the history of slavery, African Americans deserve to claim this country more. These empathetic feelings interspersed with the hurt and anger I felt in response to their denial of my belonging to this country. But there were always people who were kind. Interestingly, those who liked me often praised my English-speaking abilities. Let me highlight one other feature to this horizon. I cashier throughout junior high school, college, and intermittently through graduate school. I attended some elite schools. So during the week, I engaged mostly with white people. They clearly occupied a different class level. I still vividly recall seeing a picture in high school of one very pretty white girl sitting on the wall in Venice. The idea that she was able to go to Venice so challenged my sense of normalcy that I really could not digest it. The image still remains imprinted in my mind. I am not suggesting that all whites are rich and all people of color are not. Even then, I noticed gradations in class. The few Black students who were economically better positioned usually hung out with more whites and vice versa. But even with the gradations, generally one's race was a good indicator of one's class level. Against this weekday background of seeing whiteness and differences in class, I faced every Sunday feeling I had more in common with these folks than the whites. Yes, I had feelings of wanting distance from the Sunday folks, but I always had feelings of solidarity and empathy with them as well, knowing we occupied similar class levels. Within the complexity of the situation and the class dynamics and the racial dynamics, for in the store on Sundays, we were all minorities, though clearly we knew about the racist and classist stereotypes about each other, sits the question of how to make the right choice. It is never a single act, so let me rephrase the question as a difficulty of determining the right behavior, attitudes, or series of interactions. My desire to be good was difficult to determine in this structural situation where we were all constrained by our roles as owners and customers, and as African, Latin, and Asian American. I'm still trying to understand and negotiate my individual responsibility within this social, structurally constrained, complex situation. This experience will always influence my philosophical thinking. As a professor of philosophy, I share my past experiences because I am thinking about my responsibility to my students, my family, my colleagues, and to those who read my work in this social, structural, complex situation where Asian American women philosophy professors continue to be a minority, if not an anomaly, and academia continues to be prohibitive to the lower classes. Even as on a daily basis, I struggle with challenges to my position as a subject who knows, as a subject who can lead. I am also very aware of the privilege of holding this position. I don't know if snippets of my biography will help anyone. Most of the time, I feel like I am just stumbling along. So much seems to be happenstance. But at this stage in my life, I feel grateful that I earn my living doing meaningful work that I enjoy. I hope to motivate others to aspire to personally meaningful work. Okay, it's 1:51, Janice. So I know this is just going till 2:30, so maybe I don't have to read parts of the other one and Tia should go. You let me know, please.
Well, why don't we ask Tia to present, and then if we have more time, we can
No,
double
it's
back. Now, that was fascinating. I do have a few questions, and I'm sure our audience has questions as well, but we will wait until after Tia's presentation. Thank you. Tia, there you are.
Hi. Thank you
Hi.
so much for I love listening to Susie and Emily's like stories. It just pulls strings in my heart. But so I have a couple of pictures and I will share my screen with you. So I'm just sharing a little bit about my story as a Cambodian American woman of color living in Los Angeles. So my name is Hatia Chea, but I go by Tia. It's easier. My pronouns are she, her, hers. So I I was born in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and I because of civil wars, we had to move to like the border of Thailand, and my dad is actually Thai, so I was fortunate enough to have 2 passports and able to move and maneuver from Thailand and Cambodia depending on whether it's safe. And so growing up, I knew how to speak. I was bilingual. I was able to speak both languages, but and then when I came to the US, I did not like, my brain just went to like English mode and forgot all of my Thai language. So I'm really sad about that. A little bit about Cambodia. So my whole family, my grandparents, my mom, my aunts and uncle, they all went through the concentration camp and the Khmer Rouge in 1975. And so it was a very like bloody history in our country where it's, and like I didn't even learn about it until I was like in high school, just because nobody wanted to talk about their experiences. And I think I always talk about how like I'm learning my own history from like white men, like my white professors, and from textbooks. And I had to like watch these movies that you see here to learn about those experiences. And you know, even this movie by Angelina Jolie, like she's white. Like so it's constantly like I feel like my history are being whitewashed because my like our own people are so terrified and are so burdened with PTSD that they can't talk about those experiences. And so I still like can't even get my family to talk about things, but I think it's like their trauma have permeated into our everyday life that I feel that I can speak about like intergenerational trauma that even though I never been to concentration camp, I never experienced like starvation and harsh labor. Like those type of nightmares do show up in my family, and in a way, like if my family like had nightmares or like have panic attacks or all of those things, like I think it definitely is part of my DNA and part of my growing up. Um and so it's really hard to talk about those things. And so this is so embarrassing. So this is one of my pictures growing up. I came to the US when I was 9 years old, and so I had to kind of grow up really quickly because I think you can't. I'm gonna go to another picture because that's embarrassing. I think growing up it in the US,
It was
like,
adorable, Tia, just FYI.
thanks. um, um, Growing up in the US was really hard. I think I experienced a lot of bullying because I didn't speak English and I was a different, like I have different skin tones and different, like bringing traditional cultural food to school like was a taboo, and so it was a constant bullying. I think I had to learn to assimilate really really fast because I just didn't want to be bullied. I just want to fit in, and I was watching like Disney Channel and Lizzie McGuire, and I was like coming home and saying like rolling my eyes and saying like whatever, and all of these like um lingos, and then my family's just like, what is wrong with you? Like we didn't raise this child. Like and so yeah, I think it was definitely difficult being an immigrant in the US, and it really shaped my motivation to do better. So I you know study really really hard in school, and I was motivated to ace all my AP classes and study for the SAT and everything, and just be this is my high school picture, so be the president of every club and just be a leader. And I wanted to show people that, like, hey, you can't bully me, even though I'm an immigrant, even though I had to learn English, like I excel. And so, but I didn't do it alone. I feel like I had like the whole Asian community, it was like that type of mindset of like competition. And so we were competing against each other, but also cheering each other on because we were able to excel through and able to overcome all of these obstacles. And so when I graduated from high school and got into college, I went to UC Berkeley and majored in political science. And that was so like it was like the, I don't want to say the worst, but it was like really, really hard 4 years of my life, and just experiencing this imposter syndrome of like, oh my gosh, do I belong here? Do I fit in? Like, how did I even get here? Like all of the students were like valedictorians, and they speak they have all of these privileges, and I'm a first generation college student, and I didn't know how to fill out my FAFSA. I didn't know how to like pick out classes to take, or like during homecoming, like like my friends' parents were there and be like, oh, like, is Professor this and that is still here around, and they were going on campus tours, and I felt this like extreme loneliness and the need to find a sense of belonging. And so I was so fortunate to find professors and student affairs professionals that helped mentor me and help me navigate college. And so the dean of students at UC Berkeley took me under his wing and say, like, I see you and I see your potential, so I'm going to help you. And so I was able to be introduced to this student affairs profession, and we were reading like student affairs articles and how to help students of color and help students like me. And I joined different student organizations like the Khmer Student Association, and found people who have same experiences as me and understand what I was going through. So that was how I found a sense of belonging and family, and able to navigate college at UC Berkeley. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna graduate, so what do I want to do? And so I asked my mentor, and he was like, well, why do you see yourself as doing this, like, student affairs stuff as a career? And so he helped me get into my graduate school, which was in Shepherd's University in West Virginia. It was so cold. It was only 2 years, but it was so cold. And again, I feel like everywhere I go, I felt this sense of like microaggression or just mainly aggression towards me and my many different identities. In West Virginia, I was the only Asian person in my class, in my cohort, or even the whole town. And so like there's this one time when this like student like came up to me and hugged me, and then I was like, I don't know who you are. And he was like, oh wait, like wrong Asian, and just like ran away. And so like those little moments just make me feel like insignificant and feel like I look like everyone else, or there's this one moment where I have a conversation with someone, or like a colleague, and they said, oh, so you're Chinese? And I'm like, no, I'm Cambodian. And they're like, no, you're Chinese. And like questioning my own identities and almost like gaslighting me, where I have to be like, who am I? And so that was again 2 more tough years of school. And but I made it. I graduated, and my mom was so proud of me. Like the fact that I graduate from my bachelor and then get my master. And so that was really a great accomplishment, but I think with a lot of struggles along the way. And then my first job was at UCSD. I was working in housing and residence life, and that was like the first time feeling such main accomplishment of being able to connect to students and helping them understand how to navigate college and giving back basically, because I know how hard it was for me, and I was able to help them, get through college and persevere and help them be more resilient and provide like educational um, experiences for their student orgs and helping them in college, like transitioning from high school to college life and things like that. So that was an amazing like part of my life where I feel like, aha, I made it. And then I moved to UC Riverside, and I was able to work on a lot of different conferences and educational programming and discussions with students. And then I wasn't really, like I was telling Janice, that I wasn't really looking for a job at UC Riverside, but I was recruited, and I got a job here at Asian Pacific American Resource Center at Cal State Fullerton. And so I'm so excited to be part of the Cal State system now, because I was, UC Berkeley and then UCSD and then UC Riverside. And so now I'm switching over to the Cal State. And so I'm really excited to be here and sharing my journey with you all. So that's a little bit of my story. And so hopefully I hope that you have questions for all three of us. And I'll pass it back to Janice.
Oh, great, Tia. That was really great. There was a question in one of your slides at UC San Francisco. There are four of you, and the question from Emily was, "Which one was you?" Because you look so young. I think we realized that you were the second from the right.
I was in the blue dress.
Okay, all right. So thank you. I think at this point we'll open up to questions.
Yeah, I was wondering what kinds of things do you do at the Resource Center? How do you help students?
Yeah, so at APARC, Asian Pacific American Resource Center, we're virtual right now, but when we're on campus, we're in the library, and we provide different type of resources for students. Our main mission is providing like a sense of belonging and a home away from home for our students. And so we have a lot of different cultural programs. So last week we just had our Lunar New Year celebration, where we share our traditional cultures and teach the community about like that it's not just the Chinese New Year, but like different Asian countries celebrate and differently as well. So it was a nice celebration, virtual, but yeah, it's a place for students to feel connected and be part of an identity based. I hope that answered your question.
Oh, it does. So, this was all pre-COVID. I was interested in finding someplace on campus like that, thinking I could help mentor students from China coming over.
Yeah.
And I didn't know where to go look. So maybe after COVID is over, I'll come look you up.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so I have a question. Does that answer your question, Betty? You
Yes.
should visit the center nevertheless. It's a beautiful new center, and it houses several different I guess ethnic backgrounds. Do we want to say that? There's a Latinx center. There's the I don't know what they call it, but it's the Black American Center, and in addition to the Asian American Center. So there's several really interesting different areas in.
What building are you in?
It's in the library.
Oh, in the library. Okay.
It's on the first floor of the library.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So I have a question for Emily. In your paper, you discuss the fact that you have this pressure because you are one of the few women philosophers. And I guess my question to you is, do you think you'd have the same pressure, feel the same pressure if you were an engineer instead of a philosopher?
I don't know I don't know what you mean by pressure. Did I actually say pressure? I mean, I think there are yeah, I don't know if I said pressure, but I will give you these statistics, Janice. As I understand it, physics and engineering and computer science have 25% women.
Right.
Philosophy is worse than them. Yeah.
Yes, I guess that's my point.
Yeah.
They're more not a great number of women engineers, but I know there are 25% of
Yeah.
engineers are women, but
Yeah.
much less for philosophers.
Yeah.
And
I mean, and the good thing about engineering and physics and computer science, at 25% women, they still recognize that they have a problem. The
yeah,
philosophy as a discipline does not recognize itself to have a problem, even though women represent at this point, tenure track women are 6%, including grad students, it's between 9 and 11%. And philosophy as a discipline is still not accepting that they have a problem. So
why do you think that is? Why do you think it's not attractive to women, or do you think that the ramp ups is just not there?
I don't know what do you mean by ramp up, Janice?
Starting when girls are first beginning to be educated, is there no?
I don't think this is a problem with the woman. I think this is a problem with the discipline. I think it's because the discipline is so dominated by men, and the discipline itself, it prides itself on being the oldest knowledge discipline, right? Everything else started from philosophy, physics, science, everything else started from philosophy. The original scientists were called natural philosophers, right? So it has a history of being very proud of its discipline, and I think they're making huge efforts to guard their borders. So I don't think this is a problem of women, because this is something I've been looking at, and Carol Lee at University of Seattle, Washington has collected statistics on this, and it shows that on the introductory level, philosophy classes, the intro level classes, the first 2 years, it's always split 50-50. It represents the population of CSUF. Actually, by the 300 level, it drops. There's less than 10% women at that point. And I don't think it's because they do less better. I think that's not the right choice of it. They do worse than the male students, because I started tracking who does better in my classes, and actually the girls do better. The women students do better. So, but I think the culture is very I don't know if you notice, if we go to an APA conference, the culture is very aggressive, where we are sort of like, nope, that argument doesn't make sense, and this is why. Can you explain this? Like, it's a very aggressive culture, and I think some of the way that we make arguments have been aggressive and have been kind of discouraging to the female population as a whole, not just even Asian Americans. And these are the kinds of dialogues that, as more women enter philosophy, we've been discussing. That why do we have such an aggressive discipline, and does the aggressiveness really make the argument stronger or not, right? So I mean, these are, I think, questions that philosophy as a discipline needs to have. I don't think it's the girls. I think it's the philosophers who dominate the discipline, actually.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's us, not them. Okay. Not that I want to be claiming as one of them, but yeah, I don't think it's them. I think it's us. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So do we have any other questions from our audience? Kathryn Gilroy?
Here I am. Let's see. Oh, my video is still off. Thank you. My question is for Professor Woo, and please forgive me if I've misstated something, but I think you had mentioned that the Korean people tended to, when they came in here to the States, tended to want to establish their own self-owned businesses. for a reason. And I think you mentioned that the reason has something to do with the laws here. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah. And I also wanted to, Emily, you make a great point. I mean, this is the small businesses historically with Asian American communities has been not a go-to, but like because of lack of other options, right? There have been, you'll see this in many Asian American communities. And so what I was like for my parents, when they first came in, because they were able to come in because of the change in the 1965 immigration law, which allowed for low-skilled and high-skilled laborers. And so this is how we get a lot of people who come in as doctors or as other professionals. And then on the flip side, you get people who are low-skilled laborers. And my parents came in through the low-skilled laborers segment of that immigration law when they first came here. And so, my dad had a little bit of college, my mom had none. And so when they came to Arizona, they were sponsored by this family to come and work for their company. And that's how they were able to get their first visa to come. And then when they saved up money and they moved to Los Angeles, there was already a very significant Korean American community, and many of them owned dry cleaning businesses. And so, and cafes and, green grocers on the East Coast. These are patterns that you see. And these are, if you think about immigration and language and culture and how groups are helping one another, my parents met other Koreans and they said, you should open a cafe. And my mom said, how do I do that? And they, told her where to go, told her how to, they were part of something that I think a lot of Korean Americans were a part of, which is a rotating credit system. It's called a Chea. And so you put money in and it's like a pyramid. And then by the time you get out, you have, like $10,000 or $15,000, which becomes the seed money to start a business. And so there are these, so my parents didn't go by the way of traditional loans, which I think many Americans would go to a bank and get a loan and start a business. And they didn't go that route. They went to the Korean community, and that's how they got their money to start that first business. And from there, they, hopped around to different businesses. And so, they learned the dry cleaning business from another Korean American family. They bought the dry cleaning business from a Korean American family that was the parents or the people who owned the store they were retiring. And so then they sold it to my parents. And, when my parents sold one of their dry cleaners, they sold it to another Korean couple. And it's this, knowledge that's being passed along, within the community. And so I don't know I don't know if I answered your question, but, I think that the pattern that my parents experienced is something that is fairly common for a lot of immigrant communities, this passing of knowledge and the community.
Susie, I do you mind if I interrupt just a tad bit? Because I think that Kathryn was asking if there were prohibitive laws, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right, as opposed to, I think she was asking about were there prohibitive laws, and that's why so many Asian American communities tended towards small business stores. And as I understand it from, and I'm trying to remember the title of the book, because this was years ago when I read it, but there were a couple of Asian American history books that had talked about that there were a series of laws and or discriminatory practices where people were not hiring Asian Americans. And that was one of the reasons why they ended up having to open up stores, right? So aside from I think what the community did, I think the social social situation in the United States did not make it easy for especially educated, but even uneducated, but even educated Asian Americans to follow other venues of employment besides opening up small stores.
If I misunderstood, there are absolutely, most of the immigrants, I'll just speak for Korea, the jobs that they were able to find in the United States were not commensurate with their education levels in Korea. And so, the options weren't, if they were an engineer in Korea, they were not able to come and find these engineering jobs in America. And so again, they're kind of being not welcomed and kind of pushed out of those kinds of jobs. Some people will say it was because of language. There are all kinds of explanations for it, but it was a discriminatory practice, absolutely, on many levels. And I think that does end up pushing people towards small businesses, which you open with capital and then you build in that way. But yeah, and I should think of I could probably think of some books to share too.
Mm-hmm. You also see the same pattern with the earlier Chinese immigrants, where they established their own banks, and before the banks, they had their own system of money lending. So, and they only had enough to establish small businesses in the very beginning. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Kathryn?
Oh, yes, thank you. I appreciate all of your input on that. Thank you.
And Sue, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Okay, Susie, you talked about that your parents came under the immigration laws established in 1965, I believe. Forgetting the last 5 or 6 years, because the immigration laws are all messed up or confusing. But let's say before 2012, or as of 2012, what are the current immigration laws for people coming from Korea?
Is 2012?
Well, I just picked that year because from 2016 on, our immigration has been just a mess. And, they're starting to change things, but it's going to take a while. But I just thought, okay, 2012, 13, that would be before the 2015, 16. We don't want any immigrants, or feelings.
Okay, so if I hear you right, so your question is what restrictions were in place?
Well, or what were the laws? I mean, she said that her parents came because of the laws, because of they allowed either very highly educated or very unskilled people. And I was just wondering that was 65, that's how many years ago, over 50 years ago. And I was just wondering where those immigration laws had evolved to.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I know right after 1965, when they stopped all the exclusion acts, I believe, at least for Chinese, it was only 100 Chinese per year. And it didn't matter which country you came from. If they considered you of Chinese origin, it was limited to 100 people. And then over the years, I'm sure it's changed because, when the technology companies were growing, then they were looking for skilled people. And so I think a lot of Asians from different Asian countries, the skilled workers were welcomed. And then, after the last 4 years, there's been problems because the American companies want to keep their immigrant employees and the government wants to send them back.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the immigration laws changed a lot, through the years, but at least in the 1960s, it was limited to 100 Chinese. And I don't know, maybe that's even 100 Asians. But anyway, it was very limited.
Yeah, I think the Magnuson Law of 1943 was the one that allowed, I think it was like 105 Chinese immigrants per year. And so, there was Asian exclusion, that started with the Chinese in 1882. And then in 1960, then there were a few not little laws, they were big laws, but that allowed just a very small number of Asians and like 100 Koreans. And, there was the McCarran-Walter Act that was the 1965 Act that really opened up immigration from Asia. And so that's where my parents came in. And now, it's such a good question. I feel like there have definitely been some tweaks to that law, but there hasn't, I think the number of Korean immigrants it really exploded in the 80s, and then the number kind of became smaller. There were, maybe fewer incentives for Koreans to leave Korea. But in terms of immigration law, I don't know about, the exact, like what it is right now. I know that it builds from that 1965 law. There are work visas, there are student visas that are temporary that a lot of Koreans come to America with, and then they stay on, they go to college, and they're definitely, those visas are still similar to what was in existence because of that 1965 law. But I'd have to do more research to know like exactly what's happening in terms of, and others may know about this.
I had a question actually for Chea. You want to come back to us, Chea, or there you go. Okay. So my question, okay, let me just ask this. Do you think personally that your loss of the Thai language in speaking Thai, part of it was because you were forced to assimilate, that you were bullied and you wanted to become as American, quote, American, unquote, as possible?
Yeah, so my mom put me in like Chinese school when I was in as a toddler too. So like I think there was just too many languages in my head. I think it was, like I had to learn Khmer because that was my first language, and then Thai when we moved across the border, and then Chinese school because I don't know why. And then I was put into English school so that before we came to the US. So I think there was too many languages in my head, and I was like very small. And then I think also like the trauma of being bullying and just wanting to like fit in also definitely contributes to my loss of language and a lot of my Cambodian identities as well. So yeah, I think so.
Okay, thank you. All right, are there any other questions? I see Emily, that you have your hand up. Did you?
Is it okay if I have a question for as well?
Of course.
Okay. Well, I think Susie and I did the Korean American, and I think immigration is hard enough, but Chea seems to have done, your background, it sounds way more traumatic. In fact, it's on my list to watch the latest movie, especially, right? And I really found interesting when you said that you're now reliant on these movies from Hollywood or so to even give you a sense of your history, which is so. But I just wanted to make a little plug for Frantz Fanon talks about that trauma can be inherited, and he follows Carl Jung's work on this. Actually, that there is a collective memory, and that the collective memory can be inherited intergenerationally. So, and there is actually some recent empirical work in the sciences about this. And I think one of them that was interesting was, this was done on rats though, so not on humans yet, but like one generation of rats made a bell sound, and I think they gave them either a pleasurable or a displeasurable reaction. And the next generation all hated that sound. So it really, I think trauma does get generationally inherited. So I guess I just wanted to tell you about that to say, because when you were talking about the inherited trauma, I think that's real. I don't think that's a fiction of your imagination at all. I do think trauma. So there's enough work suggesting that. So yeah, just I guess because I found that just really fascinating. I thought, yeah. So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It is fascinating. Thank you for that, Emily. Okay, well, I think we're going to call this a day. It's been fascinating, and thank you for your engagement, audience. In 2 weeks, we will have another speaker, Tara Suwinat Chiporn, who will lead a session. It sounds like a workshop, more or less, on mindful intercultural interactions, which should be very good. So thank you very much for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much, Emily, Susie, and Tia. You've been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Thank
you
you
so much, Janice.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Tia.
everyone. Tia and Emily, I just loved hearing your stories.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. You too.
And thank you, Janice, for bringing us all together.
Oh, absolutely. My
And
pleasure.
for everyone for coming.
Bye, everyone.